Dog finds an abandoned baby on the tracks. What it did next shocked everyone. On a freezing morning in the heart of Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains, where ancient peaks brushed the pale, frost-laden sky, the stillness of dawn was pierced by a sound that did not belong. Amid the whispering pines and the towering cliffs draped in icy mist, a faint cry trembled through the air, the weak, desperate whimper of an abandoned baby. It echoed across the wilderness, fragile yet insistent, a thread of life unraveling against the vast, sleeping forest. The morning fog rolled in thick, silvery waves, cloaking the world in a dreamlike haze, and beneath its veil, a small bundle lay beside a decommissioned railway line, wrapped in a tattered blanket that offered little shield against the biting cold. The infant's cries, though soft, carried on the wind, threading through the skeletal branches and over the frost-crusted earth. They reached into the depths of the surrounding woods, where a golden figure stirred. Sonny, a golden retriever with a coat that gleamed like the first light of day, lifted his head from the hollow of a fallen log where he'd taken shelter. His ears perked, his warm brown eyes glinting with curiosity as he caught the unfamiliar sound. Sonny was no ordinary stray. He'd once been the beloved companion of a park ranger, trained to assist in search and rescue missions before his owner's retirement left him free to roam these mountains. Though he now lived wild, his instincts remained sharp, tempered by a gentle heart and a lingering memory of human kindness. In the nearby valley, Elias Bennett, a veteran forest ranger with a weathered face and a soul as deep as the mountain roots, navigated his old Jeep along a winding trail. The vehicle's faded green paint blended with the evergreens, its engine a low growl against the silence. Elias had spent decades in these peaks, their rugged beauty a balm for the grief that lingered in his bones, the loss of his wife and infant daughter years ago in a winter storm. His devotion to the Blue Ridge was more than duty. It was a lifeline, a way to honor the lives he couldn't save by protecting the fragile balance of this wilderness. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across his path, when something caught his eye. A flash of gold moving with purpose through the underbrush. Elias knew Sonny well. The golden retriever had become a familiar sight in these mountains, a free spirit who often trailed hikers or lingered near ranger stations, his tail wagging like a metronome of joy. But this morning there was a difference in the dog's gait, a focused determination that set Elias's instincts tingling. He eased the Jeep to a stop, the crunch of gravel beneath the tires swallowed by the fog, and watched as Sonny bounded toward the old railway line, his nose low to the ground. Elias's brow furrowed. That track had been out of service for years, its rusted rails a relic of a bygone era. What could draw the dog there now? The air grew colder as Elias stepped from the Jeep, his breath clouding before him. He pulled his coat tighter, his boots crunching on the frost as he followed Sonny's path. The baby's cries grew clearer, a beacon in the mist, and Elias's heart quickened, a sound he hadn't heard in these woods before, one that stirred memories he'd buried deep. Through the trees he glimpsed the golden retriever standing beside the tracks, his tail still, his body tense. Sonny's nose nudged a small shape, a bundle of cloth that shifted faintly, the source of the whimpers that pierced the dawn. Elias's breath caught as he approached, the scene unfolding like a vision from a dream. The infant lay helpless on the frozen ground, its tiny face red from the cold, its cries growing weaker with each shuddering breath. Sonny stood over it, his golden fur a stark contrast to the gray rails, his warm body pressed close as if to shield the child from the mountain's chill. The dog's eyes met Elias's, bright with an urgency that needed no translation. He'd found something precious, something in need. Elias knelt beside them, his hands trembling as he brushed the blanket aside, revealing the baby's fragile form. "Who left you here?" he murmured, his voice rough with disbelief and a surge of protective instinct. The fog parted briefly, revealing the old railway stretching into the distance, its silence suddenly ominous. Then a low rumble stirred the air, a sound that shouldn't have been there. Elias's radio crackled to life, a voice breaking through static with urgent news. A landslide had blocked the main line miles away, forcing a chemical transport train onto this forgotten track as an emergency route. His stomach dropped. The rails beneath his knees vibrated faintly, a warning of approaching danger. This was no longer just a rescue, it was a race against time. As Elias scooped the baby into his arms, wrapping it in his coat, Sonny's ears twitched, his head snapping toward the forest's edge. A rustle broke the stillness, lean shadows slipping through the mist. Coyotes, drawn by the infant's cries, emerged from the trees, their eyes glinting with hunger. Elias tensed, his free hand hovering near the flare gun at his belt, but Sonny moved first. The golden retriever stepped forward, his gentle nature giving way to a low, steady growl, his hackles rising as he positioned himself between the child and the predators. His bark rang out, sharp and commanding, a sound that echoed off the cliffs and sent the coyotes pausing in their tracks. Elias clutched the baby closer, its whimpers softening against his chest, and marveled at Sonny's resolve. This was no wild beast, but a dog whose heart remembered the call to protect, honed by years of training and instinct. The train's rumble grew louder, the ground trembling beneath them, and Elias knew they had minutes, perhaps less, to act. He reached for his radio, his voice steady despite the chaos. "This is Ranger Bennett. Emergency on the old railway line. Abandoned infant, coyote threat, and an incoming train. I need backup now." The fog swirled thicker, the scene a tableau of courage and peril. The crying infant, the golden dog standing guard, the approaching train a thunderous specter in the mist. Elias glanced at Sonny, whose eyes never left the coyotes, and felt a swell of gratitude. What no one could have imagined was unfolding before him. A golden retriever, born of human care and wild freedom, had become the first savior in a morning that would test the limits of hope and unity in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The Blue Ridge Mountains stood sentinel around Elias Bennett, their ancient peaks shrouded in a fog that seemed to pulse with the growing rumble of the approaching train. The air bit at his skin, sharp with frost, as he cradled the infant against his chest, its tiny body trembling beneath the folds of his coat. The baby's whimpers had softened to fragile gas, each breath a fragile thread tethering it to life. Beside him, Sonny, the golden retriever, held his ground, his golden fur bristling as he faced the coyotes, slinking through the mist. Their eyes gleamed like embers in the half-light, their lean forms weaving closer with every heartbeat, drawn by the scent of vulnerability on the wind. Elias's radio crackled again, the voice of dispatch cutting through the static with clipped urgency. "Ranger Bennett, backup's en route, ETA 15 minutes. Train's 5 miles out, moving fast. Can you secure the area?" 5 miles. Elias's mind raced, calculating the distance against the speed of a freight train on uneven, neglected tracks. 5 minutes, maybe less, before steel and steam barreled down on them. The old railway line groaned beneath his boots, its rusted rails vibrating with the promise of destruction. He glanced at the infant, then at Sonny, whose growl deepened, a steady rumble that kept the coyotes at bay. 15 minutes was a lifetime they didn't have. "Negative," Elias replied, his voice taut but calm. "We've got coyotes and no clear path out. I'll do what I can. Send help to the signal post half a mile north." He clipped the radio back to his belt, his free hand brushing the flare gun holstered at his side. The coyotes circled wider, testing Sonny's resolve, their yips sharp and taunting in the frigid air. The golden retriever barked again, a sound that rolled like thunder off the cliffs, and the pack hesitated, their shadows flickering in the fog. Elias marveled at the dog's courage. This was no trained guard, but a companion whose heart had answered a call beyond instinct. The train's whistle shrieked in the distance, a mournful cry that sliced through the morning stillness. Elias's pulse quickened, his eyes darting to the tracks. The rails stretched north and south, a steel spine cutting through the wilderness, and half a mile away stood an old manual signal, a relic from the line's working days, rusted but possibly functional. If he could reach it, he might alert the engineer, slow the train before it turned this quiet dawn into a tragedy. But the coyotes loomed closer, their hunger emboldened by the chaos, and the infant's weight anchored him to the spot. He couldn't run. Not yet. Sonny shifted, his paws pressing into the frost as he stepped forward, his bark rising into a fierce, unbroken cadence. The lead coyote, a wiry figure with a scarred muzzle, lunged, jaws snapping, But Sonny met it with a swift sidestep, his teeth bared in warning. The coyote yelped, retreating, and the pack faltered, their circle widening once more. Elias seized the moment, his voice low and steady. "Good boy, Sonny. Hold them off." The dog's ears flicked back, acknowledging the words, and Elias felt a surge of trust. This golden retriever, wild yet loyal, was his partner in this desperate stand. The ground trembled harder now, the train's approach a relentless drumbeat against the earth. Elias scanned the terrain, his ranger's eye tracing a narrow path through the trees to the signal post. It was a gamble, half a mile with a baby in his arms, coyotes at his heels, and a train bearing down. But standing still meant certain doom. He adjusted the infant, securing it against his shoulder, and took a step back, his boots crunching on the gravel ballast. "Come on, Sonny," he called, his tone firm but laced with urgency. The dog glanced at him, then barked once more at the coyotes, holding their gaze as Elias began to move. The fog thickened as he broke into a jog, the baby jostling faintly in his grasp. Sonny followed, his strides long and fluid, his head swiveling to track the predators. The coyotes shadowed them, their yips rising into a chilling chorus. But Sonny's presence kept them at a distance, a golden shield against the dark. Elias's breath clouded before him, his lungs burning with the cold. But he pushed on, the signal post a faint silhouette in the mist. The train's whistle sounded again, closer now, its headlight a dim glow piercing the haze like a hunter's eye. The path twisted through a stand of pines, their needles brushing Elias's shoulders, and the infant stirred, its cries sharpening with the jolt of movement. "Hang on, little one," Elias whispered, his voice a lifeline in the chaos. He ducked beneath a low branch, his boots slipping on icy roots. But he steadied himself, driven by a resolve that echoed the loss he'd buried years ago. This child would not slip through his hands, not today. Sonny bounded beside him, his barks a rhythmic counterpoint to the train's roar, and Elias felt the weight of their shared purpose, a man and a dog, racing to defy fate. The signal post loomed closer, its rusted frame a beacon of hope amid the trees. Elias burst into a clearing, the tracks gleaming dully before him, and skidded to a halt beside the ancient mechanism. The lever was stiff with years of neglect, its metal cold against his palm as he yanked it with all his strength. Rust flaked away, the gears groaning in protest, but it wouldn't budge. The train's rumble was deafening now, its vibrations rattling his bones, and the coyotes' howls grew bolder, their forms darting through the fog. Sonny spun to face them, his growl a fierce warning, his tail low and rigid. Elias shifted the baby to one arm, his muscles screaming, and gripped the lever with both hands, throwing his weight into it. "Come on," he grunted, his voice raw. The mechanism screeched, then jolted free, the signal arm swinging upward with a clang. A faint red light flickered to life, its glow weak but unmistakable, a cry for the train to stop. Elias stumbled back, chest heaving, and looked down the tracks. The headlight blazed brighter, the steel beast hurtling closer, its brakes screeching faintly against the momentum. Sonny barked, sharp and insistent, as the coyotes pressed in, their patience fraying. Elias drew the flare gun, firing a single shot skyward, a crimson streak that arced through the mist, a desperate plea for help. The train's whistle blared, a sound that shook the cliffs, and Elias clutched the infant tighter, his eyes locked on the rails. Time stretched thin, the fog swirling around them, and in that frozen moment, he wondered if Sonny's courage and his own would be enough to outrun the dawn's deadly promise. The Blue Ridge Mountains trembled under the weight of the approaching train, its roar a relentless tide crashing against the cliffs. Elias Bennett stood beside the rusted signal post, the infant clutched tight against his chest, its tiny breast warm against his neck despite the freezing air. The flare's crimson glow faded into the fog, swallowed by the mist that cloaked the wilderness in an eerie half-light. The signal's red lamp flickered feebly, a lone sentinel against the steel beast hurtling down the tracks, its headlight now a blazing eye cutting through the haze. The ground shook violently, pebbles skittering along the rails, and Elias's heart pounded a frantic rhythm. Time was slipping through his fingers like the frost melting beneath his boots. Sonny, the golden retriever, stood firm before the encroaching coyotes, his golden coat a beacon in the gloom. His barks rang out, sharp and unwavering, a wall of sound that held the pack at bay. The lead coyote, its scarred muzzle glinting with menace, darted forward, testing the dog's resolve. But Sonny lunged with a snap of his jaws, driving it back. The pack yipped and circled, their hunger a palpable force in the mist. Yet Sonny's presence, gentle yet fierce, kept them from closing in. Elias marveled at the dog's tenacity, a golden retriever whose soul burned with a protector's fire, honed by training and kindled by some deep, unspoken bond.
The train's whistle screamed again, closer now, its brakes screeching in a desperate wail against the momentum. Elias's eyes flicked to the tracks, the headlight swelling into a blinding glare, the silhouette of the engine emerging like a phantom from the fog. He shifted the baby, its whimpers rising with the chaos, and pressed a hand to its back, whispering, "Hold on, little one. Just hold on." The signal had worked. He'd seen the red light catch the engineer's eye, but the train's speed was a force of nature, its chemical-laden cars a ticking threat on these brittle rails. If it didn't stop, if it derailed, the mountains would bear the scars for decades. Sonny's growl deepened, his ears pinned back as the coyotes grew bolder, their shadows weaving tighter through the trees. Elias drew his flare gun again, loading another cartridge with trembling fingers. But before he could fire, a new sound broke the din. A low, rhythmic thudding from the south. Headlights pierced the mist, twin beams slicing through the haze, and the growl of engines rose above the train's roar. Relief flooded Elias's chest as a pickup truck burst into the clearing, its tires skidding on the frost. Behind it, a jeep followed, its horn blaring, a chorus of hope cutting through the dawn. The truck's door flew open, and Mara Tate, a retired railway worker with steel-gray hair and a voice like gravel, leapt out, her old work jacket emblazoned with a faded Norfolk Southern emblem. She carried a signal flag in one hand, her eyes sharp with the focus of decades spent on the rails. "Elias!" she shouted, her breath clouding as she ran toward him. "Saw your flare. Heard the call. What's the play?" Her gaze flicked to the baby, then to Sonny, who barked at the approaching vehicles but held his ground against the coyotes. "Train's diverted. Chemical cargo," Elias yelled over the noise, nodding toward the tracks. "Signal's up, but it's not stopping fast enough. Coyotes are after the kid." The jeep screeched to a halt beside them, and two more figures emerged. Jed Harper, the hardware store owner, hauling a coil of rope, and Lila Grayson, a nurse with a medical bag slung over her shoulder. The Blue Ridge Hollow community had answered, their lights a constellation of defiance against the morning's peril. Mara didn't hesitate. She sprinted to the tracks, her flag raised high, waving it in a practiced arc, a universal cry to slow down. "If the brakes are failing, we'll need a buffer," she called, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Jed, get that rope! Tie it to something solid!" Jed nodded, racing to a nearby oak, his hands swift as he looped the rope around its trunk. Lila knelt beside Elias, her hands gentle but firm as she checked the infant. "Cold but breathing steady," she said, pulling a thermal blanket from her bag and wrapping it around the child. "We need to move, now." The train loomed closer, its brakes shrieking, metal grinding against metal as it fought to halt. Elias handed the baby to Lila, his arms aching but his resolve unbroken. "Take her to the jeep, keep her safe." Lila nodded, cradling the infant as she ran back, her figure vanishing into the mist. Elias turned to Sonny, who stood panting, his eyes locked on the coyotes. "Come on, boy," he urged, and the golden retriever followed, his barks fading into sharp huffs as they joined Mara at the tracks. Jed tossed the rope's end to Elias, who caught it and looped it around a second tree, forming a taut line across the rails. "It won't stop it," Mara warned, her flag still waving, "but it might slow it enough." The train's headlight bathed them in harsh light, its horn blaring a final warning, and Elias braced himself, Sonny pressing close to his side. The rope snapped taut as the engine struck it, the oak groaning under the strain, and for a breathless moment, the train's speed faltered, its wheels screeching sparks into the fog. The coyotes, startled by the noise, scattered into the trees, their howls fading into the distance. Elias's radio crackled. Dispatch again. Ranger Bennett, train's engineer, reports brakes engaged. Slowing but not stopping. ETA 1 minute. 1 minute. Elias exchanged a glance with Mara, her face grim but determined. We've done what we can here, she said, stepping back. Get clear, now. Elias grabbed Sonny's scruff, pulling the dog with him as they stumbled away from the tracks. The train barreled past, its cars a blur of steel and shadow, the rope snapping like a gunshot as it gave way. But the buffer had worked. The train's speed bled away, its brakes finally gripping the rails. With a groan that shook the earth, it shuddered to a stop, steam hissing from its undercarriage, its front car just yards from where Elias had stood. Silence fell, heavy and surreal, broken only by Sonny's soft whine. Elias sank to his knees, his breath ragged, and the golden retriever nuzzled his hand, his tail wagging faintly. Mara approached, her flag dangling at her side, and clapped a hand on his shoulder. You and that dog, she said, her voice thick with awe. Never seen anything like it. In the jeep, Lila cradled the baby, its cries now a soft murmur, and Elias looked to the mountains, their peaks piercing the thinning fog. The dawn had held its breath, and they had answered its call. The Blue Ridge Mountains exhaled as the train's hiss faded into the frost-laden air, its steel bulk now a silent monolith astride the old railway line. The fog began to lift, tendrils of mist peeling back to reveal the jagged peaks piercing a sky streaked with the first blush of dawn. Elias Bennett stood in the clearing, his knees pressed into the damp earth, his breath clouding in ragged bursts. The weight of the morning's peril lingered in his bones, a tremor of exhaustion and relief that made his hands shake as they rested on Sonny's golden fur. The golden retriever leaned into him, his warm flank a steady anchor, his tail wagging faintly, as if to say the worst had passed. The infant's cries had softened to a murmur, cradled in Lila Grayson's arms within the jeep. Elias rose, his joints protesting, and turned to the vehicle, his boots crunching on the frost as he approached. Lila met his gaze through the open door, her nurse's hands deftly adjusting the thermal blanket around the baby. She's warming up, she said, her voice gentle but firm, a lifeline in the chaos that had unfolded. No frostbite, just cold and scared. We need to get her to the clinic. Check her properly. The baby's tiny face peeked from the blanket, eyes shut tight, lips trembling. A fragile miracle against the mountain's harsh embrace. Elias nodded, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. He reached out, brushing a finger against the infant's cheek, its skin soft and cool beneath his calloused touch. Who leaves a child out here? He murmured, the question a whisper lost in the wind. Sonny nosed his leg, a soft whine escaping the dog's throat, and Elias glanced down, meeting the golden retriever's warm brown eyes. You found her first, didn't you? He said, his voice rough with gratitude. Sonny's tail thumped once, a quiet affirmation, and Elias felt the thread of their bond tighten. A man, a dog, and a child, bound by a dawn none could have foreseen. Mara Tate approached, her signal flag tucked under her arm, her gray hair catching the morning light like strands of silver. That was too close, she said, her gravelly tone softened by awe. Your flair, that dog's grit, gave us the seconds we needed. She glanced at the train, its chemical cars gleaming dully in the rising sun, then back to Elias. Engineers shaken but fine. Says the signal and our rope trick saved a derailment. No spill, no disaster. Jed Harper joined them, coiling the snapped rope around his arm, his weathered face creased with a tired grin. Took a village, didn't it? He said, nodding toward Sonny. And a damn fine dog. The air filled with the hum of approaching vehicles, backup from Blue Ridge Hollow arriving at last. A sheriff's cruiser rolled into the clearing, followed by an ambulance, their lights flashing through the thinning mist. Sheriff Amos Reed stepped out, his broad frame dwarfing the cruiser, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. Heard your call, Elias, he said, his voice a low rumble. Train, coyotes, and a baby. Sounds like a tall tale if I didn't see it myself. He tipped his hat to Sonny, who sat panting beside Elias, then strode toward the jeep to confer with Lila. Elias lingered by the tracks, his gaze drifting to the spot where Sonny had stood guard. The golden retriever had faced down coyotes, held his ground as the train bore down, a companion whose courage rivaled any ranger's. He knelt, scratching behind Sonny's ears, and the dog leaned into the touch, his eyes half closing in contentment. "You're something else," Elias said softly, a smile tugging at his lips. The memory of his lost daughter flickered through his mind, her tiny hand in his, gone too soon, and he wondered if this morning was a chance to mend a piece of that broken past. Lila emerged from the jeep, the baby now swaddled in a thicker blanket, her arms steady as she handed the child to a paramedic. "She's stable enough for transport," she told Elias, her breath clouding in the chill. "But we need answers. Where she came from. Who left her?" The paramedic nodded, securing the infant in the ambulance, and Elias felt a pang of reluctance as the tiny form slipped from sight. Sonny whined again, nudging Elias's hand, and he rose, following the dog's gaze to the forest's edge where the coyotes had vanished. Sheriff Reed returned, his notepad in hand, his expression grim. "No tracks, no signs of anyone else out here," he said, scratching his jaw. "Blankets old, worn thin, could have been out here hours. We'll search the area, but this feels deliberate. Someone didn't want her found." Elias's stomach twisted, the weight of the words sinking in.
An abandoned child, left to the mercy of the wild. And yet, Sonny had found her, defying the odds. "We'll figure it out," Reed added, clapping Elias on the shoulder. "You and that dog bought her time. That's what counts." The ambulance doors closed, its siren a soft wail as it pulled away, and Elias watched it disappear down the trail, Lila riding alongside. Mara and Jed began coordinating with the train crew, ensuring the chemical cars were secure, while Reed organized a search team to scour the woods. Elias stayed by the tracks, Sonny at his side, the morning sun now spilling golden light across the frost. The mountains stood silent, their peaks a timeless witness to the drama below, and Elias felt their presence like a steady hand on his back. He glanced at Sonny, whose ears perked at the rustle of leaves, and crouched to meet the dog's gaze. "You're not going anywhere, are you?" he said, half a question, half a promise. Sonny licked his hand, his tail wagging with renewed vigor, and Elias chuckled, the sound raw but real. The golden retriever had chosen him, or perhaps they'd chosen each other, in a moment that rewrote the dawn. The baby was safe, the train stopped, but questions lingered like shadows in the mist. Who had left her? Why here on these forgotten rails? As the community buzzed around him, Elias felt a pull toward the forest, a need to understand the story behind the child Sonny had saved. The mountains held secrets, their silence a canvas for whispers of the past, and he knew this was only the beginning. With Sonny beside him, he stepped toward the trees, the frost crunching beneath his boots, the light of a new day guiding their path into the unknown. The sun climbed higher over the Blue Ridge Mountains, its golden light spilling across the frost-kissed grasslands, banishing the last wisps of morning mist. The old railway line lay quiet now, its rusted rails a silent witness to the chaos that had unfolded beneath the dawn. Elias Bennett stood at the forest's edge, his boots sinking into the damp earth, the scent of pine and wet leaves sharp in his lungs. Beside him, Sonny the golden retriever nosed the ground, his tail wagging in gentle arcs as he traced scents only he could decipher. The train loomed behind them, its chemical cars secured, while the hum of voices, rangers, sheriff's deputies, and townsfolk filled the clearing with a steady pulse of life. Elias's hands rested in his coat pockets, his fingers brushing the frayed edge of a photograph he always carried, his daughter smiling in a sunlit moment stolen by time. The infant's rescue had stirred that old ache, a tender wound reopened by the feel of the baby in his arms, its fragile warmth a mirror to what he'd lost. Yet Sonny's presence grounded him, the dog's golden fur a beacon of hope against the shadows of memory. Elias glanced down, meeting Sonny's bright eyes, and felt a quiet resolve settle in his chest. "You knew she was out here, didn't you?" he murmured, his voice rough but warm. Sonny tilted his head, a soft huff escaping his muzzle, and Elias smiled, a rare, unguarded curve of his lips. Sheriff Amos Reed approached, his heavy steps crunching on the gravel ballast, his notepad now tucked into his coat. "Search teams fanning out," he said, his deep voice carrying the weight of authority. "No footprints, no tire marks, just that blanket and a few broken twigs. Whoever left her covered their tracks." He paused, his gaze drifting to Sonny, who sat attentively at Elias's side. "If it weren't for that dog, we'd be telling a different story. How'd he know?" Elias shrugged, scratching behind Sonny's ears. "He's got a heart bigger than most folks. Heard her crying, I reckon. Couldn't let it go." Reed nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Well, he's a hero now. Word spreading through Blue Ridge Hollow. Folks are calling him Sonny the Savior. Kids will be begging for golden retrievers by noon." Elias chuckled, the sound low and raspy, but his mind lingered on the mystery. The blanket, thin, patched, smelling faintly of wood smoke, offered no clues, its origins as obscure as the mountain's deepest hollows. Who would abandon a child here, in the dead of winter, on a track no one used? The question gnawed at him, a splinter beneath the skin. Mara Tate joined them, her railway jacket slung over her shoulder, her face etched with the fatigue of a morning well spent. "Train crews cleared to move once the line's inspected," she said, wiping her hands on her jeans. "No leaks, no damage. Your rope trick held, Elias. But I keep thinking about that kid. Someone knew this track was out of service, or thought they did. That landslide changed everything." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication, and Elias's brow furrowed. A deliberate act, then. Not a panicked drop, but a calculated risk gone awry. The forest stretched before them, its pines swaying in the breeze, their needles whispering secrets the wind couldn't carry. Elias felt a pull toward it, an instinct honed by years of patrolling these mountains. "Sonny found her near the tracks," he said, his voice steady. "Might be something else out there. Something we missed." Reed raised an eyebrow, then nodded. "Take the dog, have a look. I'll keep the team on the main trails. Radio if you find anything." Mara clapped Elias's arm. "I'll check with Jed, see if anyone's been poking around town lately. This doesn't sit right." Elias whistled softly, and Sonny sprang to his feet, his ears perked with eager purpose. Together they stepped into the woods, the underbrush crackling beneath their weight, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in dappled patches. The air grew cooler here, shadowed by the trees, and Elias's senses sharpened, every rustle, every scent a clue in the wild's vast puzzle. Sonny led the way, his nose low, his tail a metronome of focus. They retraced the path from the tracks, the golden retriever pausing now and then to sniff a root or paw at the earth, his instincts a compass Elias trusted implicitly. The baby's cries echoed in Elias's memory, a fragile thread guiding him deeper into the forest. He scanned the ground. Broken twigs, a scuff in the moss, a faint indent that might have been a boot. Sonny stopped abruptly, his body tensing, and Elias knelt beside him, following the dog's gaze to a cluster of brambles. There, half buried in the frost, lay a scrap of cloth, coarse, gray, torn from something larger. Elias pulled it free, his fingers tracing its edges. It smelled of sweat and ash, a faint hint of kerosene clinging to the weave. "Someone was here," he muttered, pocketing the fabric. Sonny whined, nudging his hand, and Elias nodded. "Let's keep going, boy." The forest deepened, its silence broken only by the distant call of a hawk and the crunch of their steps. Elias's mind churned. Kerosene suggested a camp, a fire, a life hidden in these hills. The Blue Ridge was home to recluses, wanderers who shunned the hollow's lights. But abandoning a child felt darker, more desperate. Sonny bounded ahead, his golden coat flashing through the trees, and stopped at a narrow creek, its waters glittering like shards of ice. He pawed at the bank, his nose buried in the mud, and Elias hurried to his side, his breath catching at the sight. A faint footprint, half erased by the stream, its edges softened but unmistakable. He radioed Reed, his voice low. "Found a print by the creek, half a mile west of the tracks. Cloth too, kerosene scent. Someone's been out here." Static crackled, then Reed's reply. Copy that. Sending a deputy your way. Stay sharp. Elias clipped the radio back, his eyes tracing the creek's path upstream. The mountains loomed larger here, their shadows stretching long and cold, and he felt the weight of their secrets pressing down. Sonny sat beside him, his gaze fixed on the horizon, and Elias rested a hand on the dog's head. We'll find them, he said, a promise to the golden retriever and the child they'd saved. Whoever they are. The sun climbed higher, bathing the blue ridge in a light that promised answers, and Elias stood, Sonny at his heel, ready to chase the whispers of the wilderness to their source. The baby was safe, but her story, and the shadow that had left her, was only beginning to unfold. The Blue Ridge Mountains stood cloaked in midday light, their peaks casting long shadows across the forest floor as the sun traced its arc above the pines. Elias Bennett followed the creek upstream, his boots sinking into the soft mud along its bank, the faint footprint they'd found now a beacon in his mind. Sonny, the golden retriever, padded ahead, his golden coat catching the light like a flame flickering through the trees. The dog's nose hovered close to the ground, his ears twitching at every rustle, his instincts a guide through the wilderness's labyrinth of secrets. The air carried the bite of frost and the earthy tang of decay, a reminder of winter's grip on these ancient hills. Elias's hand brushed the scrap of cloth in his pocket, its kerosene scent a whisper of intent. A camp, a fire, a life hidden in the shadows. The footprint by the creek was small, too narrow for a man's boot, its edges blurred by the water's flow. A woman, perhaps, or a youth, someone light on their feet, fleeing or hiding. His mind churned with possibilities, each one darker than the last. The baby's abandonment gnawed at him, a puzzle with missing pieces, and Sonny's steady presence beside him was a comfort, a partner whose loyalty needed no words. The creek widened, its waters gurgling over smooth stones, and Sonny stopped abruptly, his body tensing. Elias knelt beside him, following the dog's gaze to a cluster of brambles near the bank. There, tangled in the thorns, lay a leather cord, its ends frayed, a single bead, blue and chipped, dangling from its length. Elias pulled it free, his fingers tracing the bead's worn surface. Another clue, he muttered, his voice low. Sonny whined, pawing at the earth, and Elias scanned the area, his ranger's eye catching a faint trail. Broken twigs, crushed ferns, leading deeper into the woods. He radioed Sheriff Reed, his tone clipped. Found a cord with a bead west of the creek. Trail's heading north. Looks fresh. Sonny's on it. Static buzzed, then Reed's reply. Deputies 10 minutes out. Watch your back, Elias. Could be someone still around. Elias clipped the radio to his belt, his hand resting briefly on Sonny's head. Let's see where this takes us, he said, and the golden retriever bounded forward, his tail a metronome of purpose as they followed the path. The forest thickened, its canopy swallowing the light, and the trail grew clearer. Scuffs in the moss, a snapped branch, a smear of mud on a rock. Elias's pulse quickened, his senses sharpened by years of tracking. Sonny moved with quiet grace, his nose tracing the scent, his ears flicking at the distant call of a crow. The trail curved toward a rocky outcrop, its face jagged and shadowed, and Elias slowed, his hand hovering near the flare gun at his hip. A faint whiff of smoke drifted on the breeze, wood smoke, tinged with kerosene, and his stomach tightened. They were close. Sonny stopped, his hackles rising, and Elias crouched beside him, peering through the underbrush. Beyond the outcrop, a small clearing emerged. A makeshift camp, its fire pit cold but ringed with ash. A tattered tarp slung between two trees. A tin cup lay overturned in the dirt, its rim dented, and a pile of rags huddled in the corner. Clothing, perhaps, or bedding? Elias's breath caught as he spotted a small shoe, its leather cracked, half buried in the leaves. Too big for the baby, but small enough for a child, or someone desperate. Easy, boy, Elias whispered, his hand on Sonny's scruff as the dog growled low. The camp was empty, its silence heavy with absence. But the signs were fresh. Someone had been here, maybe hours ago. He stepped into the clearing, Sonny at his heel, and examined the fire pit. The ashes were damp, the embers long dead, but a faint warmth lingered in the soil beneath. They left in a hurry, he said, his voice a murmur. Sonny nosed the rags, his whine sharp, and Elias knelt, lifting a corner. Beneath lay a scrap of paper, crumpled and stained. A note, its ink smudged but legible. No choice. Forgive me. Elias's chest tightened, the words a dagger of sorrow and rage. He pocketed the note, his mind racing. A mother? A sibling? Someone torn by desperation? Sonny barked once, sharp and urgent, his head snapping toward the trees. Ilias rose, his hand on the flare gun, as a rustle broke the stillness. A figure, slight and hooded, darting through the shadows. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the rocks. But the figure vanished, swallowed by the forest's embrace. Sonny surged forward, his barks ringing out, and Elias followed, his boots pounding the earth. The chase was on, the mountains watching in silence as man and dog pursued the truth hidden in their depths. The Blue Ridge Mountains loomed like silent guardians as Elias Bennett plunged through the forest, his boots pounding the frost-crusted earth, his breath clouding in the frigid air. Sonny, the golden retriever, surged ahead, his golden coat a streak of light against the shadowed pines, his barks echoing off the rocky outcrop as they chased the fleeting figure. The trees blurred past, their branches clawing at Elias's coat, but he pressed on, driven by the note's haunting words. No choice. Forgive me. And the weight of the infant's fragile life, now safe but still tethered to this mystery. The mountains held their breath, the wind a whisper of secrets as man and dog pursued the truth. The figure darted through the underbrush, slight and swift, their hooded form weaving between the trees with the desperation of a cornered deer. Elias glimpsed a flash of pale skin, a tangle of dark hair beneath the hood. Young, he thought, barely more than a child themselves. Sonny's barks grew sharper, his paws kicking up leaves as he closed the gap, and Elias shouted again, his voice raw with urgency. Stop! We're not here to hurt you! The figure stumbled, their foot catching on a root, and fell hard against a moss-covered boulder, a soft cry escaping their lips. Elias slowed, his chest heaving, and raised a hand to halt Sonny, who skidded to a stop, his growl softening to a whine. The golden retriever stood poised, ears perked, his eyes locked on the figure as Elias approached cautiously. Easy now, he said, his tone steady but gentle, a ranger's calm honed by years in the wild. The figure shrank against the rock, their hood falling back to reveal a girl, no older than 16, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her dark eyes wide with fear. In her trembling hands she clutched a small knife, its blade dulled but glinting faintly in the midday sun. Who are you? Elias asked. Kneeling a few paces away, his hands open to show he meant no harm. Sonny sat beside him, his tail brushing the ground, his presence a quiet reassurance. The girl's breath hitched, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't want to leave her. I had to. Her words cracked, a dam breaking, and tears spilled down her cheeks. They'd take her, hurt her. I thought, the tracks. No one comes there. Elias's heart clenched, the pieces falling into place. The camp, the note, the kerosene-scented cloth. Who's they? He pressed, his voice soft but firm. The girl shook her head, her knife lowering slightly. My stepfather, he's bad. Said she'd be trouble. Cost too much. Mama's gone and he... She choked on a sob, her gaze darting to the forest as if expecting pursuit. I couldn't keep her safe no more. I thought she'd be found. By someone good. Elias's throat tightened, a surge of sorrow and anger mingling in his chest. He saw his daughter in her words, a life discarded, a parent's failure, and felt the weight of his own past pressing close. Sonny edged forward, his nose nudging the girl's hand, and she flinched, then stilled as the dog's warm tongue brushed her fingers. The knife slipped from her grasp, clattering to the ground, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Elias moved closer, resting a hand on her arm. You did what you could, he said, his voice rough with emotion. She's safe now, because of you, and him. He nodded to Sonny, who wagged his tail, his eyes bright with understanding. The crackle of a radio broke the moment, Sheriff Reed's voice cutting through. "Elias, deputies here. You got anything?" Elias unclipped the radio, his eyes never leaving the girl. "Found her, a kid, scared stiff. Camp's abandoned. Bringing her in." He stood, offering a hand. "Come with us. We'll sort this out. Get you both safe." The girl hesitated, then took his hand, her grip trembling but resolute. Sonny pressed against her leg, a golden guardian, and together they retraced their steps, the forest parting before them like a curtain drawn back on a new dawn. By the time they reached the clearing, Blue Ridge Hollow had rallied. The ambulance had returned, Lila Grayson tending to the infant, now named Dawn by the nurse's gentle suggestion, while Sheriff Reed coordinated with deputies to investigate the girl's stepfather. Mara Tate and Jed Harper stood by, their faces softening as Elias emerged with the girl, Sonny trotting proudly at their side. The girl, whose name she whispered was Clara, clung to Elias's coat, her eyes darting at the crowd. But Sonny stayed close, his warmth a shield against her fear. Lila approached, Dawn swaddled in her arms, and Clara's breath caught, a sob breaking free as she saw her sister. "She's okay?" she asked, her voice small. Lila nodded, offering the baby to her. "Thanks to you, and them." Clara took Dawn, her arms trembling, and Sonny nosed the bundle, his tail wagging furiously. Elias watched, his chest tight with a bittersweet ache. This wasn't his daughter, but it was a family he'd helped save. Reed pulled Elias aside, his voice low. "Stepfather's known, troublemaker up in the hollows. We'll bring him in. Clara's got no one else. Social services will step in, but she's a fighter." Elias nodded, his gaze drifting to Clara and Dawn. Sonny sprawled beside them like a golden sentinel. "She won't be alone," he said, a promise forming in his mind. The community buzzed around them, voices rising with offers, Jed with blankets, Mara with food, Lila with a spare room. Blue Ridge Hollow had opened its heart, a tapestry of care woven in the wake of crisis. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the peaks in hues of amber and rose, Elias sat on a log near the tracks, Sonny at his feet. Clara and Dawn were with Lila, safe and warm, the first steps of their future unfolding. Elias pulled the photograph from his pocket, his daughter's smile a quiet echo, and felt a tear trace his cheek. Not grief now, but release. "I did good today, didn't I?" he whispered, and Sonny rested his head on Elias's knee, his eyes warm with unspoken agreement. The mountains glowed in the fading light, their silence a hymn to resilience and redemption. Elias scratched Sonny's ears, the golden retriever's tail thumping the ground, and knew they'd found something enduring, a purpose, a family, a home in the wild. The baby's cries had called them together, and in answering, they'd rewritten the dawn. As night fell, the Blue Ridge stood watch, its peaks a promise that hope could bloom even in the coldest shadows.